Get into position.
Welcome to Time to Talk Special Edition. My name's Jonathan Williamson, and as always, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Today, my episode's going to be a little bit different from other ones that you've probably seen. I want to build on a discussion that I started in an episode I shot on October 11th, 2023. This was 4 days after the Hamas attack in Israel, in which over 1,200 Israelis were killed. And I'm going to go into a little bit more details about that attack that have been revealed since the time that I shared that episode. And if you haven't seen that episode, I would invite you to, we'll have the link in the comments. Please follow it below. It's about 40 minutes, but it's very informative about the significance of this conflict, about what we're seeing take place even now, today, that is built word for word off of what God showed me was going to be taking place just 4 days after this attack. I mean, it's scary, but it's necessary for us to understand because everything is pointing to the same thing. And so today, instead of giving you the prophecies, instead of giving you the scriptures, I'm mainly just going to focus on giving you the current events of what's taking place in the Middle East for those that are paying attention, but then looking at it through the spiritual lens that we're called to do. You've got to realize, I said it in my earlier episode, hopefully you've just gone back, you've watched it, and now you're back with me here. I said that in God's eyes and according to the world, that Israel is the epicenter. It's the epicenter of the world. It is God's chosen land and people. So as far as he's concerned, Israel is the center of everything. Well, the prophecy in Zechariah about a reeling that was going to take place around Jerusalem, that God was going to cause, and he was going to make it a heavy stone that all of its friends and all who tried to lift it would be hurt or would be damaged by it, is taking place before our very eyes. Listen, I'm sure you know, but just in case, quick recap. What happened on October 7th? Okay. Hamas had over 1,000 militants that went into Israel, and what they did has not been heavily reported on as much because most of the focus is being taken in Gaza. But I want you to understand what actually took place that day so we can really understand some of the motivation and mentality behind Israel's decisions and why they're doing what they're doing. You see, these 1,000 militants came in unexpected, without warning, going after citizens, civilians, women, and children. And I'm talking from toddlers to the elderly. But they didn't just target them. Now that details came out, I shared in the earlier episode about the babies that were found in the cribs that were decapitated, bathed in their own blood. I told you about the families that were found tied up and bound in their homes and executed on the floors. But at that point, I hadn't even had the confirmed reports of dozens of children tied together and set on fire, burned alive, of babies ripped out of the wombs of their mothers while they're still alive and decapitated before them, of women being raped with knives and their organs being pulled out through their uterus and their birth canal while they're still living, of being raped and having their breasts and arms cut off and thrown from them. And then right at the point as their aggressor is about to climax, execution. And they continue with their bodies. And the worst part is, as they weaponize these women's bodies, and this was with children, y'all, and with the elderly, with grandmothers and with children, as well as middle-aged adult women. But as they did all of this, there was no mercy given because they didn't even let them live. It was shame unto death. Okay? Now that you've got that image in your mind, now that you see exactly how painful it must have been for them as a people on that day. Again, I'm not defending what's taking place in Gaza. Let me get there. But we have to look at this from both sides if we're truly going to understand how this conflict is growing and going to continue to grow. Because I've had people telling me I'm an alarmist. I've had people tell me that I'm causing panic. I've had people telling me that I'm looking too far into things. But I tell you what, guys, even though it's hard for even me to believe because it's a hard thing to truly grasp, the Bible lays it all out. And I see piece by piece how this is all coming together. I mean, headlines day after day after day. And I've got screenshots scrolling back behind me that you can see. And I'm not going to go into all of them. But again, if you've got a television or the news has been on, you've been following and seeing what's been taking place as this conflict is growing. and the risk of it becoming a regional threat. But I tell you, by the time it becomes regional, this thing's turning global. Alarmist. It's in the Middle East. You realize how much space there is between Europe, how much space there is between South America, Central America, North America. It's not going to be all that. Read through what's happening. I said in that earlier episode that as Israel created a humanitarian crisis because Netanyahu himself, who is a soldier, has to try and save face, because he has to try and set an example and defend his nation and people against any would-be aggressors, as well as the already aggressors, or those who have already aggressed against them. But as he's doing this, and as he's coming down so strong-handed, he is creating a spirit of resistance around the globe towards Israel. And it is growing 4 days after the attack, after Hamas, after that stuff that I just told you about took place. There were celebrations around the entire world of support for Palestine and those in Gaza, but not just support for Palestine. But there was celebrations around the world calling for the death of Israel after they were attacked. Now, to understand that, we have to realize, and please hear me at this. Again, I support Israel. I pray for Israel. I do not necessarily agree with everything Israel does. Neither does God. Read your Bible. They've got a long history of rebellion and going against what God instructed them to do, and they have paid a very heavy price for it. But again, we have to understand this is a people whose identity, who they've known with barely more than a single generation, they have suffered through the heaviest genocide ever enacted in the history of humanity. They have come face to face with those who would seek to globally mobilize to erase them from existence. And that is a recent memory. 1 to 2 generations is not a very long time. So they have this buildup, this brace, they have this guard already within them as a people, not just one or another, as a people against any threats to their existence. Now you take to the Palestinians on the other hand. They were displaced, and this is the generations that follow the refugees that were displaced when Israel took possession of the land in 48. And as neighbors, they have not necessarily been nice neighbors throughout these years, and that is very much an understatement. They've been at each other's throats. But this tension that's, for that reason, most people think, well, it's just the Middle East. It's what happens. There's always a war. Every 10, 15 years, there's a war between somewhere out there. That's what they do. The Middle East is a powder keg. Well, that's kind of true historically, but this time's different, y'all. This is moving and impacting so much more than just the Middle East. Okay. So, how is this going to grow? Okay. So we've looked at what's happened thus far. Just a quick recap, quick summary. We had the attack. Netanyahu declared war. He mobilized 300,000 IDF members at that time. Okay. They prepared for a ground offensive. They began bombarding Gaza with missiles and rocket fire. Thousands, tens of thousands of missiles that have been fired at Gaza since October 7th. All right. And remember, we're talking about an area that's, I think, only 140 square miles. It's not a big area. And it is a very densely populated area. Well, they cut off the power, the fuel, the water. Now, I believe only like 13 of 36 hospitals are going. And all you see on the news constantly, day after day, are women and children suffering, dying, being pushed to the brink of starvation, buildings coming down on top of them. I mean, young boys and girls being pulled out of the rubble. Families torn apart, 90% of the population displaced. All right. This is, and I'm not going to lie, they have created a humanitarian crisis. Do I foresee them stopping? No. Does part of me wish they would? Absolutely. But I don't think it's going to. Why? Because the Bible said it was going to take place. I mean, you've got to realize something. If you truly understand what the Word of God says about the final times, if you truly understand what the Bible says is yet to come, then what we've seen thus far is nothing compared to what lies ahead of us. Because right now, when it was just Hamas, fine. Hamas, Israel is bad. Gaza, whew, Lord, help the people there. But now you've got other groups, all Iran backed, who are somewhat involving themselves, not going too far. You've got Hezbollah, which is considered to be the most well-armed paramilitary group in the world. It received hundreds of millions of dollars of support from Iran every single year just for the purpose of establishing and building up their armaments. They sit on the southern border of Lebanon with Israel. Them and Israel had a 34-day war back in 2006, okay? Where am I going with all this? Just follow me. So they had a 34-day war. And what happened, part of the resolution, the UN declared a resolution at that time, which stated that the Hezbollah were going to move 10 miles back from the border, all right? They still haven't done it. Israel and Hezbollah at this time have been exchanging a little bit of fire, missiles flying 3 to 4 miles in across the border, one to the other, but they've not yet allowed a full-scale war to come out. Neither of them really wants it at this point. Even the leader of Hezbollah has said now is not the time that they're going to win by points. He's trying to save face. But Israel, for some reason, because God declared it was going to be, in this moment of this little skirmish, and as they are in the mode of heightened defense for their own nationality and security, they have been informing their border towns and evacuating tens of thousands of people from their border towns with Lebanon and declaring to the mayors of those towns that they are going to push Hezbollah back to that 10-mile line that was set in the UN resolution. Okay, so that their people can feel safe, because Netanyahu is now coming under growing pressure from the people in those border towns because they can't go back home. If Israel pushes Hezbollah back into Lebanon, that will escalate the war. But more than that, so you've got Hezbollah, you got Israel. They're duking it out a little bit, but Hezbollah has even admitted they're mainly just trying to distract Israel and utilize resources that would otherwise be utilized in Gaza. Then you've got Israel attacking Gaza. You've got all of those nations that I shared about in the first episode of this who have been rallying in celebration and support of the Palestinian people, who have been rallying against Israel. And then you've got this growing tension in the other nations from the humanitarian crisis that's being created, and even among the allies of Israel, that is causing pressure to build on global leaders of powerful nations. But there's only so much, even as a staunch ally, that a leader of a nation can defend that many civilians being affected by an armed conflict. And now, with that division growing even wider, even some of those allies are coming out and comparing this operation, this conflict in Gaza, to genocide, which I'm not arguing whether it is or isn't. It might actually meet the qualifications. Israel, I love you, but God knows, God help you. The Holocaust that the president Lula of Brazil just said, now that one's going a little too far, because anyways, I'm not getting into that part. But even Joe Biden is now having to put down, which I give him credit. He stood by Israel far longer than I thought he was going to originally. But even he's drawing the line. And in the UK and everywhere else, in the UN and the US, they just vetoed a ceasefire right now that's supposed to be brokered between Israel and Gaza, because they're saying it's going to affect the negotiations. But you got to think about this in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of the Middle East, in the eyes of those who don't think the way we do. They already have us in the Western world as enmitize, as enemies. They already view us and have set their goals, national and local, as the destruction of the Western world and Israel. These people hate us just for being us, okay? But now you've got a direct conflict that is spreading and moving. Excuse me. And you have this growing humanitarian crisis that is about to get a lot worse. Because I was just reading today The World Food Assistance Program just suspended their operations in Gaza because they can't get their trucks in there safely, because the people, the masses that have been displaced, those that have been eating dog food and rice and just trying to survive, have gotten so desperate that they're attacking the convoys, that they're stopping the trucks, they're beating the drivers, they're stealing the food. The desperation in that small area with 2 million people trapped is growing to the point where true famine and starvation is about to be widespread. And when you see people start starving to death, that's when motivation arises. So Hezbollah is limiting itself. Iran is definitely limiting itself right now because it doesn't want to necessarily get involved in an all-out war with Israel, knowing that the U.S. would possibly end up intervening, and then Russia, and then But now you get the Houthis. Okay? What are the Houthis doing? So you've got the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and I'm sure you've read about them, that they're firing missiles on the shipping lane in the Red Sea. They are directly impeding and attacking 12% of global commerce and trade. Wait, 12%? That don't sound that high. What's so bad about that? Well, you got to understand geopolitics a little bit. All right, because you've got growing pressure on these external economies and the external powers in these other countries just for the sake of the humanitarian crisis that's being created. However, that humanitarian crisis is still somewhat distant from the vast majority of the populations of these nations in the world. It's not directly affecting them in their homes. However, start attacking the wallets of peoples in their homes, peoples in other regions, people who might not be necessarily affected by the violence, but are going to start to feel the effects of this and the consequences of this conflict. And then all of a sudden you have another story. Because look, you've already got nations and continents. You've got superpowers around the world that are still struggling, that have never recovered from the COVID pandemic. You've got rapid inflation in all of these economies. You've got struggles with import, export. You've got political problems that are taking place, but the economies worldwide are still very fragile and a shell of what they were before. But then you start stacking on 12% of the commerce. All right. And then the delays in the deliveries. Now, what I mentioned about geopolitics is this: the current world order and most of the superpowers exist and have been built upon a system that is built on an upside down pyramid. Okay. After the Second World War, the U.S. Navy and this U.S. security decided that it was going to take personal responsibility for securing international trade routes in the international waters of the world. So what did that do? That basically meant that the U.S. was going to protect and guarantee through its Navy, which has the largest Navy in the world, any shipping and any materials from any of these developing nations. And why did it do that? Well, because a lot of that product was flowing to the United States. And it hyper drove our economy, but not just ours. It did it to a large number of nations that without that shipping would not have possibly been able to build like they did. So now you've got these nations, these cities and nations that have built up incredible economies and infrastructures and populations that have been sustained not off the natural resources readily available to their local region, to their land, but that have only been available through shipping. Take Dubai, for example. They built an indoor ski slope. Okay, Dubai has a ton of money. And for that, they have had a major, massive influx and incredible construction of their economy. However, what does Dubai not have? An abundance of water, an abundance of food. It's a desert land. So if shipping and trade, if they were no longer able to safely export their oil and sell it to other nations in order to import all of the other necessary commodities that they need for their country to continue growing or even to sustain at its current levels, well, then all of a sudden you're going to start having a collapse of social order within that nation. And it's the same, not just for Dubai. I mean, it's the same for Japan. Germany's pretty well set. Or no, Germany's going to struggle. Russia's pretty well set. The U.S. is pretty well set. Latin America's going to struggle. But there's these nations all around the world that have only grown over the last 6 decades to where they are because of the availability of those resources that wouldn't otherwise be ready for them. So it's not just the 12% and the inflation and the wallets that are going to be hurt, but as this starts to spread and as shipping lanes, because now that the Houthi rebels are doing it from Yemen across all those ships coming through the Red Sea, now that that's fair game. And as this escalates and this tension rises, well, then all of a sudden you've got a threat to the very existence of these other superpowers that are located in completely different parts of the world. And that's where people get jittery. That's where people get ready to fight. You start threatening the existence of a nation. Why? Look at Israel. Look how willing and ready they are to fight for their existence. Now extrapolate that out. Plus, I mentioned in the other one as well, you've got Iran's axis of resistance, which the Hezbollah and the Houthis are only a part, but they've got a number of paramilitary groups all throughout the Middle East that are loyal to them, that are supported by them, and that work in conjunction with them. You've got new political ties being created between China and Russia and other nations around Europe and in Asia. Then you've got NATO, being NATO like they've always been, UN. I mean, you've got all these coalitions. And everybody's raising arms. Everybody's strengthening themselves. Everybody's bracing for something that is yet to come. So what am I saying with all this? I talked in the last episode, and we read through the prophecies that said that Israel would be surrounded, that they would be pressured and pushed to make an agreement that they were instructed never to make with the inhabitants of the land that they pushed out when they were establishing their own. And that pact would be a downfall. It would be a trip hazard for them that would cause their own downfall and demise. As this humanitarian crisis grows, as this conflict grows from a local conflict to a regional conflict and then spreads from there, as that whole area starts coming under the risk, and then the tensions between Russia and the U.S. because of Israel and Ukraine and Iran and everything else, as this is all culminating and boiling and the tensions growing, and we start to see worse and worse humanitarian disasters taking place. I hate to say it, the Bible doesn't say the end times are going to be pretty. They're going to be very ugly. This is just the beginning. But you're going to see all of this building, and then hope for the future is going to disappear, and then all are going to be convinced that the end of the world is coming, and we are going to be on the brink of the war to end all wars, that it's going to be the apocalypse, that the end of the world is going to be set, and then boom, all of a sudden, one man is going to arise in the midst of all of it and do what no one else thought was possible. He's going to establish peace. He's going to offer not only a ceasefire, but a peace agreement to Israel and to the Muslims, to the Palestinians. He's going to, as part of this, grant access back to the Temple Mount for the Israelis, and they'll be able to begin doing their sacrifices. Well, like I shared in the last episode, that peace is a false peace, and us Christians, knowing what we know, at least myself, as long as you ain't killed me before then yet, I'm going to be screaming while you're saying peace and safety. I'm going to be screaming, no, 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 beware, beware, beware. Because the abomination of desolation upon the wings of desolation is to come. And that will begin that great tribulation. And that will begin that process of the final time before the Lord comes back and establishes his millennial kingdom. But right now, we're seeing all of this unfold. We're seeing all of this take place. Scientists have even said, and not even just because of Israel and the conflict there in the Middle East, but also, if you can't believe it from a biblical perspective, just look at the world we live in. Between creating artificial intelligence, which has the capacity of 10,000 people versus one that we couldn't possibly hope to control, or our genetic modification using the CRISPR technology, which allows us to custom tailor our own genetic viruses so we can make one just that spreads like COVID but kills like Ebola, or between climate change and the overheating of our world and our inability to actually be responsible humans and start to clean up our act. I mean, humans, guys, I love all of you, but I'm including myself in this group. We're not the brightest creatures. But all of it And then I did an episode about the influence of the devil, how open and embraced it's becoming, and how he's moving through this generation. I mean, everything's just pointing to the same thing. And there's still a few years. I mean, that 70th week of Daniel, like I mentioned in the other episode, it's got to begin. And that starts when that false peace agreement is signed. From that point, set your clock. You got 7 years. When that peace agreement's set, I don't know. There's still, believe it or not, a lot of escalation that is going to take place from where we are now. But it's about to pick up speed as quickly as it's been escalating anyways, and as much scrutiny that Israel and its allies have been coming under. The allies are growing weary. That rock that is Jerusalem is getting heavy, and the damage is taking place, and they are about to buckle, and they're going to give in. And then all of a sudden, you've got all these enemies of the Middle East, and you've got the whole world plus all of Israel's allies telling them to make this agreement they were never supposed to make. It's taking place. And watch now. I think today's February 19th, 20th? Keep your eyes on what's taking place and how quickly it's about to jump. Because now, Gaza has reached a breaking point. Like I said, only a third of their hospitals are up. And you read reports of doctors talking about having to leave people screaming for hours in hospitals because they have no medicine or painkillers to give them. Talking about starvation of people. Talking about schools and hospitals being completely destroyed and beyond repair. Talking about having to move 500,000 to 1 million people at a time who've already left everything in their homes and are being pushed from left to right by the Israelis who, the narrative is growing. It is spreading, it is moving. And we need to be ready, not blind. We've got to open our eyes and realize that we as the church, as all this is taking place, we have a purpose and a calling that we are supposed to be following and enacting. We are supposed to be doing a lot right now that I don't see happening. That's why I'm here. That's the why for walking by the word. I'm not here telling you that I'm the greatest professor that's ever existed. I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers, but I do know what I know. And I've seen what I've seen, and I believe what I believe. And I know my God. And he's told me that now is the time that we edify the body of Christ, that we rise up and prepare ourselves for this final day to walk as his body, to walk as true Christians, that we might make it to the end and receive that eternal reward. So, I don't know if this is as informative as I was hoping it was going to be. Honestly, I don't even know if this was coordinated how I was hoping it was going to be. But I do know this. We live in unprecedented times. And everything that I see taking place, everything, lines up with what that word says is going to happen in the preparation for the final times. And if you want to call me an alarmist and you want to think I'm off base on it, that's fine. You ain't got to believe me. I'm not here to change your heart. I'm just here to share the truth. Whether you want to apply it to your life, that's up to you. But in the meantime, as long as I got breath to breathe, I'm going to keep sharing until I do stand face to face with my Lord and Savior in that beautiful day of his return. That's what I had for y'all today. I'm still planning and praying for the time to go in and do my intensive special series on the final times and on eschatology, and to tell you about the man of lawlessness and the abomination of desolation, to talk about the revealing of that time coming and that great tribulation, and why, Jesus said it very clearly in Matthew 24, I do believe we are going to be here and going through that. But don't despair. Because yes, there are difficult times yet to come. But for we that know the truth, for we that know our God, we should be celebrating, not in the pain and the suffering of others, but in the knowledge that although this time is short, eternity is right around the corner. And the reward that we've been promised is about to be manifest. God bless all of you. I love you. See you in another episode.
Get into position.